Here's part two of our pro-life, pro-choice Christian Perspectives Reload. So let me give you a little bit of background on me, Melissa. And Ellen, I think you kind of know this, but I grew up very evangelical. When Priscilla's my wife, when we were just getting to know each other, I remember the Gore-Bush election and how one of her best friends was working for the Gore campaign and how she was kind of excited about Al Gore. And I'm like, how could you vote for someone who is pro killing babies? Like, how could, and pretty much just roasted her. Like this is you can't do that. And I would say for a very long time, it's like rape and incest. Like, that's so horrible, but we just can't terminate a human life. I remember thinking through, maybe the only situation would be if the mom's life was in jeopardy, but still my knee-jerk reaction to that was, well, what if God wants to do a miracle? Like, if the doctor says either the mom's going to die or the baby's going to die, what if you still try to have that baby and God works out a miracle? I would say the first time that I rethought anything from very black and white, I was on a men's hike, ironically, with a lot of evangelicals, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and it's funny, he had the British accent, he's a scientist, so you get the whole feel, just this brilliant scientist guy, and very evangelical, and I was absolutely stunned. So we had all the time in the world to talk about all kinds of stuff because we're literally hiking for miles and miles and miles and miles. Abortion comes up, and he literally says, I think there's a whole lot of things going on here. Like, there's some people who feel like until there is consciousness, is that an actual human? Or there's other people that feel, is that a human if the heart's not beating? And I could not believe that he was questioning anything. I was like, oh my gosh. And so now I would say that I'm definitely in a learning stage. I feel like I would still, if you want to break it down to pro-choice and pro-life, and I'm looking forward to our listeners hearing, Melissa, how you don't use those terminologies. I guess I would say I'm more pro-life, but I think it's a lot healthier, maybe. I don't know. Ellen, why don't you give us a little bit of your journey, and then I want Melissa to jump in. Is that okay, Ellen?
Yeah. No, very similar to you, Joey. I remember wearing a George W. Bush t-shirt and knowing only that the right way and I was, 16? I didn't even vote. But just being so proud that I was pro-life. Because, just the same shit we hear now, which is like, if you vote any other way, you might as well just be taking a machete to newborns. Right. I've come a long way. I consider myself to have a consistent life ethic, which I'm really proud of. And I am happy to say that when there's a gray area, I am comfortable saying I don't know. And I believe that nobody wants abortion to be a need or a necessity for anybody. And that if only politically conservative people could figure out that they actually have the tools to get rid of abortion other than making it illegal, by creating support for women who think they need abortion. I've changed a lot about the way I feel about it. Now I consider myself to be pro-choice politically, but very anti-abortion ethically. it's nuanced as shit in here, man. It's confusing. It's like, yeah, but what about an ectopic pregnancy? And ectopics are like, that's always the elephant in the room for me. I love talking about it.
Yep. So Melissa, what name do you go by? There, you have a couple of last names, is it?
Yeah, it's all part of the last name. Yeah, all the whole thing.
Say it all. Fleur.
Give it a shot. Give it a shot, Joey. I want to hear you say it.
Fleur Bixler.
Yeah.
Boom. Look at that.
It just looks like it sounds.
Gotcha.
Which is nice.
So Mennonite pastor, you graduated from Duke. Holy cow. So you hate the Tar Heels? Or you don't care?
Yeah, because of the Nicole Hannah-Jones thing, like it's very hard right now to like have any sort of good feelings about UNC.
Yeah.
We have it's complicated, but not because of basketball, because of racism.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I was gonna say you don't. I mean, don't know you at all, but you don't scream basketball fan to me.
I do love Duke basketball. I feel like it's like kind of like an ethical like sore spot, but but it is what it is.
So you'll get a kick out of this. My wife and I, we just took a trip a few months ago to pick out our little puppy, and it was in that area. So we went to the Duke campus, and I'm just a huge basketball football guy. And so we did a little bit of investigating, and I was hoping against hope that maybe I'd be able to sneak a peek on the inside of the basketball coliseum or whatever you call it. And so we were pretty sure that we had found the building, and there were like some Duke students walking around and everything. And I just couldn't help it. I said, "Excuse me, sir." He was probably younger than me. I said, "Is this where the Blue Devils play basketball?" And he smiled. And he said, "That's it." And then in front of a bunch of people, I was just like, I just had to know. I just needed to stand here, and I just had to know. And these young students are like laughing at this old guy that's just like, I just needed to know. Needed to know.
Need to touch the hem. That's right. Yeah.
So, Melissa, do you understand that black and white mentality of, hey, this should not even be on the table?
Yeah, absolutely. I also grew up in a very pro-life home with a parent who was a one-issue voter. But I think for me, the sort of unraveling of the politics of abortion, it started pretty early. I remember in middle school, there was a Young Republicans club, and I grew up right outside of DC. So like politics was very visceral in my community. And I remember coming home and telling my mom, I was like, "Mom, something is wrong," because they said that they were they were against abortion, but for gun, like people having guns.
Right.
And that, like, obviously that's wrong. Right. And she's like, "Actually, honey, I have something to tell you." And I was like, blah, blah. And I was like, and I can't, it's just like so classic. I was like, "No, I'm sorry. Like a human adult, like who's been alive for a long time, you must be wrong. And I, a 12-year-old, must be right about like that you're wrong, like, because something is amiss here." So like from very early on, I could sense that something was up with the conversation. But it is really hard to get past the like you're murdering babies part. Like which is like, I think why it works so well as a political tool for the Republican Party. And so I was kind of laughing because I don't know what happened along the way, but my first presidential election was also Bush Gore, and I voted for Ralph Nader.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Wow.
I was like,
I've never met anyone that's voted for Nader.
I am the one.
That's pretty cool.
You, Ellen. It was like, I went to Nader rallies in Boston. I was like very into the Ralph Nader thing. So even then, like my politics have been pretty far to the left in a way that, yeah, I mean, from like very early on, again, that haven't always mapped naturally onto sort of what we consider the polarization of the two parties. And so I think that it's been a journey. That's been a journey for me too. But perhaps something that maybe just is a bit of a different part of my story than yours.
So we will run into this every now and then. Priscilla, my wife, on Facebook said something that made it clear that Trump not being president was kind of like, man, this is cool. And there was a dear lady that we love and basically said, how could you? And it was abortion. Yeah. How could you? Abortion. Like, basically, that's what you're saying. Abortion. How could you? And what you said, like, I understand that mentality for sure. But man, if the Republican Party hasn't done a number on this one.
Right. And I think one way we can, like, just in the numbers that we know that is, we know something like 87% of Black voters vote for Democrats. And the vast majority of Black people in this country are social conservatives. They are anti-abortion, and they are not for LGBTQ rights. Like, that is, it's not as if the Democratic Party is like the base of the Democratic Party is Black Americans, and so to say, oh, how could you?
Right.
You're basically saying that to, like, basically the vast majority of Black voters in this country. And so you never hear, or I shouldn't say never, you very rarely hear that argument coming. Well, obviously, we're not going to vote for Republicans because Republicans, like, want us, like, are for our destruction, right? As Black people, like, and there's, like, a myriad of ways that we see this. And I mean, one of the most, I think, like, stunning examples of this is when we look at the states that have the most stringent abortion restrictions, also have the highest infant and maternal mortality rates.
Wow.
And those mortality rates are vastly skewed towards Black women.
Right.
These are the states that have refused to expand access to Medicaid, which leaves many women without access to healthcare during their pregnancies. So, like, we'll take Mississippi. Highest infant mortality rate in the country, 8.6 deaths for 1,000 live births. In Louisiana, the preterm birth rate for Black women is 51% higher than all other women. Right? Gosh. So of course you're not, like, you can be anti-abortion all day long. And if you are also supporting laws that are the death of Black women and their babies.
Right.
And so this is, again, where, I think we hear this a lot. Pro-life is just pro-baby, right? That's actually not true. It's not even pro-baby. It's not pro-fetus. It's not pro-baby. And the most you could say is that it is an attempted protective class for healthy white infants. But it is the same people who are for restrictions on abortions overwhelmingly and consistently are support laws that make it more difficult to have babies that are healthy, and more likely for women to die in childbirth.
Gosh. Oh man. We were emailing back and
coming at us with those stats.
I got the stats. I love it. I'm just here to drop the science.
Yeah. Right? Hey, for you to validate yourself before this interview, you got to give us some verses too. You can give us stats, but you give us. Hey, so we were emailing back and forth, and I was like, "Hey, I want to talk to you about your book also." And you said, as far as, like, speaking about the time, that you wanted to make sure that we honor, in your words, the complexity and trauma of this moment for women and health of women. I would love to hear the heart behind what you just said.
Yeah. I think that those statistics are highlight sort of the issue that we're facing. And, as we're recording this podcast, we're waiting for the Supreme Court to issue a decision on a Mississippi abortion law that would basically restrict abortion to the point where most women don't even know they're pregnant before So it narrows the window down to maybe 2 weeks, maybe even less than that. And so this is I think the time where those of us who maybe have been sitting on the fence about this question, or, we don't really know, I think as we're expressing here, the complications of this, it's about to get very real for a lot of women. And a lot of women who have very little access to healthcare, who have very few options, who are in poverty, who are Black and Latina, are going to find themselves faced with, it seems to be moving in the direction of pretty much a total elimination on the choice to end a pregnancy. And so I think it's an important time for us to sit with what does that actually mean for our world going ahead? And it means a lot more than even just more babies in our country.
Yeah. So let's go to the scientist, British accent hiker guy. Where do you fall when it comes to the actual morals? Do you have it worked out in your head? Some of that stuff scientifically, is he or she a human at this early of a stage? And I do want to point out some hypocrisy that, golly, a friend of mine even acknowledged this hypocrisy. He's anti-abortion, pro-life, and him and his wife, they have frozen embryos that are never going to be touched because they have their kids now and there's leftovers. And so he's dealing with that hypocrisy, but my gosh, it's there. That's a big thing to be very pro-life, but to say, we're not going to do anything with that. But I'm curious the morals and how you've thought that through, especially given that it sounds like your journey started in similar places as Ellen and I.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually what was also a big piece for me, and sort of the politics of this, because I don't think the politics can be separated from the ethics or the morality of this. But that sort of light bulb moment for me as well of, when was the last time you saw somebody protesting an IVF clinic, right? And there are likely millions of embryos, like your friend, easily. It is a completely unregulated industry, right? And it's likely that most of those embryos are going to be destroyed or used by science. And we don't have any laws moving through states that I know of that are attempting to put restrictions on assisted reproductive technologies that produce embryos. Right. So something feels amiss here. Right. I also know that 14% of evangelicals think that having frozen embryos is immoral, and 56% believe abortion is immoral.
Wow.
But what's the difference?
How is there?
How much
any
of
difference?
that do you think is body autonomy? Because I've kind of sunk in recently to realize that body autonomy is not a Christian value at all, which is why, us as women, we're taught, our body is God's until it's our husband's, and it's never ours, which is, I think, why Christians have such a hard time understanding.
Wait, that's true, right?
What
you just
argument.
Said.
You're shut up, Drew. But I think with the IVF, I think it's so interesting because it leaves the woman's body out of it, and there's no argument about it.
That's exactly right, Ellen.
Gosh.
Yeah. When have you heard stories about the women? It's always we hear about the fact that there is a fetus involved, or a blastocyst, or an embryo, right? But that's almost always a one-sided conversation. And it's a woman-based conversation, because there are also no laws that are going to punish men who impregnate women who do not want to be pregnant. In fact, in Mississippi, there is a law that a sperm donor is not the legal parent of the child that's produced through that sperm. How does that make sense? Hey.
Well, that actually makes sense to me, because if they are a sperm donor and it's anonymous, then you're basically just like providing a cell structure. So to me, it makes sense that they're not like legal parents, but they're still biological. Oh, I see what you're saying. There it is. I got that.
Right. Because if that's true for men, why? Like it's inconsistency of that, right?
It's the patriarchy.
Absolutely, Ellen. It is.
There would be no abortion without sperm, Joey.
That's correct. Every abortion results from a man's a mission that produced a fetus that was unwanted.
Yeah.
Right? That's the key. Yeah. That's the key. And men are never, literally never, a part of this conversation in terms of punishment, in terms of responsibility, in terms of tracking. Now, it's not that hard to do. Like, we have DNA tests. This is not an impossibility. So we start sort of adding, I think these are like building blocks. Mm-hmm. So you have like, oh, wow. Look at that. The IVF industry is actually like $1 billion industry that 85% of the people who use it are white. Mm-hmm. Abortion is vastly used by women of color who are in poverty. Okay, so we have those building blocks. Right. We have, we're not actually concerned about embryos. We're just that are outside of women's bodies, just those that are concerned. We're just concerned with those that are inside of women's bodies. Well, that's interesting. Men aren't responsible for this, but women are. Right. Oh, that's interesting. How do we fit this all together? Right. And so eventually you develop this picture that there's something going on here that I think that word hypocrisy is really important. That there is a hypocrisy happening in the pro-life movement, in the anti-abortion movement, that is not willing to grapple with the fact that if there is an exception, you can no longer call abortion murder. And so that's really where I think this gets to your question about.
Well, under the law, it's not murder, correct? The terminology is not.
Not yet. But I'm saying for the pro-life movement. And I think this is actually, I really actually like when people say baby killer. I mean, if you really do believe that a sack of 100 cells is a baby equivalent to a 1-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 60-year-old, that then we need to just be clear that what you're saying is that anybody who ends a pregnancy is a murderer. Like this is the way our law works. You don't get like, there's no like, this person was, unless you're in Florida, I guess, like going to harm me. And so I killed them, right? Centoya Brown, you still go to jail for the rest of your life, right, for murdering your sex trafficker, right? Like there are no exceptions. And so what people who are pro,
but the only difference between that sack of cells and a 13-year-old is time and cell development. And the difference between a 13-year-old and an 80-year-old is time and cell development. So ethically, like, to me, that makes sense. There's no difference between like the vagina is not a magical, like, human life giving tunnel, because there's nothing magical that happens between my uterus and in my case, the floor of my bedroom where my babies came out. And so that's always such an interesting conversation for me, is like where human, quote unquote, human life begins, personhood. Because for me, I've had to say, well, it's not at 18 weeks. It's not at 24 weeks. I have to say, for the argument's sake, so that I'm not wishy-washy, I have to say at conception, because science tells us that's when new DNA started. So it's been really tricky because I have a consistent life ethic, and I believe that in no violence whatsoever, and I believe that abortion is violence, and I believe that personhood starts, science tells us, when there's a new unique DNA developed, which is at conception. It's like, well, shit, that is a hard place to land because I don't want to be there, but I kind of have to. So you're right. I have to say, if you're going to, like decapitate, a 37-year-old, and abortion most of the time is decapitation. To me, that's both equal violence. And so it's hard to land on but it's, it's, do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's so hard for me to have a consistent life ethic and be politically very liberal, but then come back to this sack of cells argument. And it's like, it's so hard to weasel my way out of it without just saying, well, I decided that life begins at conception and I have to navigate this through relationship instead of just saying, you're wrong, I'm right here. Like, this is a good example of a lot of conservative people who hold my belief would say, well, you're wrong, you're sinful. It's a challenge for me to say, you're absolutely right. And this is wild. And I don't know.
Yeah. And Ellen, I want to just jump back to a few things. So one, most abortions happen before 12 weeks, over 86 of them. And that is usually, and that's a non-surgical procedure. And so there isn't actually there's no any of the sort of like things that we hear about fetuses being pulled apart or like, none of that happens. It's all done with.
Well, a DNC is pretty brutal. I've had one and it is no joke.
So anything that happens before 12 weeks is going to be a chemical abortion. Right. It's not a DNC. Right. And that's something like 86% of abortions. So I would just.
Oh, you're saying before 12 weeks.
Yeah.
I had a DNC that's regardless.
Yeah.
I had it at 13 weeks. For a miscarriage, sure. I should say.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be surprising?
Yeah. But just to say, the vast majority of abortions are not DNCs. They're chemical abortions where someone is given a pill, they're sent home, their bodies.
That pill almost killed me, by the way. That misoprostol almost actually killed me.
And so the other thing I just wanted to kind of push on is the scientific definition of personhood is different than the scientific definition of what it means to be a human. So I think we can agree that you're right. At conception, something human is made. It's not a frog. It's not a penguin, right? It's human DNA. That does not mean that is a person. Personhood is a moral and ethical decision that has been made at different points in different cultures over time, and it cannot be settled by science.
Are you talking about sentience? Sentience, is that the word?
Like a person with rights. So a person with rights, according to our Constitution, according to like when does life end? Right, is when you no longer have brain activity. That the brain activity we're talking about is actually really hard to chart. But we almost certainly know that there isn't enough brain activity for there to be anything like consciousness until a fetus is at least 22 to 25 weeks old. And so I want to just, this is where I think it's really important for us to distinguish between when is something human, which I think we all agree, a fetus, a blastocyst, a bag of cells is human. And when does it have the rights of personhood that not only equal to, but trump the rights of the being upon whom it is dependent to live? That's actually that is the legal question. Yeah. And what's difficult is the personhood question. When does something become a person? We don't have something that tells us what that is. And that's actually,
which is why laws always change. Personhood is viability, and viability changes all the time based on science and technology.
Right. So we'll say 22. I don't think we've had a fetus survive before 21 weeks without support. Right. A lot of people would say,
But my favorite pushback on that though is if I had my baby, because I had both my babies at past my due date. So if I had left them on the floor and just with no support, that they also wouldn't be viable. Like we still are responsible for supporting them, viability or no viability. I always like that argument because it's like, well, of course they need support. They can't eat on their own,
but then again, you could say that about literally anybody.
Right?
I mean, right, that just sort of, it kind of feels like it kind of runs into the absurd eventually because you're sort of like,
yeah, it's one of those debates that it's fun if the other person
right.
having the debate.
Because eventually you end up with this sort of like, yeah, it just feels absurd eventually. Like obviously there's a difference between being able to breathe on your own and needing your mom to cook you breakfast in the morning because you're 4, right? Like there, right. Like I think we can conceptually agree with that. But I really think that where like the rubber hits the road on this is the legal decision that's going to come about because of, I think, a shared belief that people have with you, Ellen, that that personhood, that rights begin at conception. So I think, Ellen, this is really helpful because I think it's important for us to trace out what that means. Because right now, like more or less what you're saying is I recognize that I believe life begins at conception, but I recognize other people don't believe that. And so they can make a different decision. And so I guess the question would be, how much do you really believe that if you're willing to say, I'm actually okay with somebody murdering someone, right? Like it can't really, this is what I mean about exceptions. It can't be both. We can't say this is a person at 5 or 6 days old and they have all the rights of a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 70-year-old, an 80-year-old, but we're okay with some people murdering those people. Like,
well, I'm not, but you're talking about because I said I believe that it's in a woman's right to choose.
Right.
And the reason I've landed there is because until we get to a point where abortion is not felt necessary, I don't think making it illegal is going to solve any problem. And so I do think it's a snuffing of life. I don't say murder because legally that's not the term that's correct, I guess. I guess
no, but it would
killing,
be like if
killing.
If you took a viable pregnancy, 23 weeks, and you induced or you did something to end that pregnancy, that would be murder. And so if you're saying that life actually begins and has rights at conception, at hour 0, then it's not just snuffing out life, it's murder.
Well, I feel that it's murder, but the language in our law says that it is not murder. And so I'm just careful about the language because I know that it is not legally murder as we stand today.
But you think it's murder, right?
I don't think it should. Well, and I'm still like, I'm not black and white about it. I know that there's nuances, just like I said with ectopic.
Did I hear you correctly when you said that you do believe that human life is created at the time of conception? Did you say that, or were you describing somebody else? I want to make sure I heard you.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I don't know what else we would call it, right? Like it's not like a fingernail or like something has happened. So that is human life.
But consciousness is a big deal.
Yeah, I think the question for me is that personhood.
Yeah.
And I think more and more, again, sort of what you're saying about the science is that it feels like that's a really tough call to make and to legislate for this country, which is exactly what we're seeing happen. And so this is why I actually think it is important for us to come to some sense of clarity that this that this period of time between conception and viability is actually this unlegislatable area, is how I would actually say it, because it requires a moral and ethical way of thinking about what is happening in that moment, in each of these moments, that depends on something outside of, like, do you think it's science? Again, do you think it's because enough neural pathways have developed for you to have a conscious being? Again, that would be around viability.
Yeah.
Is it when and this is again, like one of these pro-life misnomers, the heartbeat, right? Well, you just happen to have enough cells that, like, there's no like circular system like that's happening at 12 weeks. Like what you have is like the beginning of the formation of heart cells that begin to move in rhythm. Is it when, like, you have to make these decisions? Is it, like Ellen is saying, because DNA is formed, and when new DNA is formed, that's a soul.
Yeah.
This moved around for the Christian church for years. Yeah. Like Aquinas had this sort of like, oh, it's first.
What's Aquinas?
Thomas Aquinas, the theologian. Have you heard of him? Yeah, just a pretty famous theologian, and he had sort of this theory of like that there was first a vegetative soul, and then an animal soul, and then a human soul. And there just have been places that the church has been all over the board, even within the church, like not even like within the greater social order, that has not been able to fully answer that question. And so what I think is what makes sense to me is to say that, like, we recognize the weightiness of this, right? Again, this is why when Joey reached out to me, I was like, I'm not like, oh, this is like no big deal. Like until the baby's viable, like you can just like, I do think like we
do whatever you want with it. Just right? Hack it up.
Yeah, like I think we have people who have miscarriages, right? Like, and this is like an incredibly like, there is an emotional attachment. There is a sense of loss, like that is real. That is not just sort of like manufactured. And so I think there needs to be like some other way that we talk about the discernment for the church in that sort of conception to viability period that does not include the state using the apparatus of punishment and regulation in order to make decisions which have overall, over and over again, been misogynistic, have been racist, and have largely been ableist. And so this is where like my gray area is like, it doesn't have to be like, oh, this is equivalent to a 1-year-old. Like that feels incredibly problematic to me. Like that is like,
well, all of those hypotheticals are problematic. Like the IVF tube full of, you've heard that, but it's like, would you grab the 5-year-old or and I did this on another podcast. It's like, that's a stupid argument because every human would look at the boy and take the boy because we're human,
right?
We have an emotional attachment to the living, breathing 5-year-old.
That's right. And there in Ohio last year, there was an IVF lab where one of the employees left the door ajar. 4,000 embryos were just
murdering 4,000
people. Is that 4,000? Like, is that equivalent to like,
that's like 2 9/11s, 3 9/11s.
9/11s. Do we really want to prosecute that man for 4,000 deaths? Wow. Because that is what it means to say that life begins like that personhood begins at conception.
That's right.
Yeah.
That is the cost of this. It means that women are going to go to jail for having abortions. Like
that's what scares me is the criminality of it. Yeah. That's why I always keep myself from going off the ledge and focusing on the women who are faced with these situations. And that is what has gotten me in the middle. I also think about like, if we're talking about consciousness, like what about people who are unconscious for a while? You know what I mean? Or it's like, are they not a person anyway?
Yeah.
It's too much. It's too much.
Let me give you this example that I think is like pretty heartrending. A family in my congregation decades ago I was not alive at this moment when this happened. They had a baby with a congenital heart disease. And they were told they could go through this extensive 4 or 5 surgeries for this baby. And then they would be painful. They would most likely kill this baby on the table. And that even if every single surgery they overcame these odds, this child would only live to be 3 and almost always be on oxygen. It would like just incredibly poor quality of life. And they had to decide. It's like my actual worst nightmare. Like,
yeah, you know what I think about that though is like, for the rest of, and I would hope that these people would never hear this, but for the rest of your life, when you make a choice like that, it wasn't the congenital heart failure that killed that or that ended the life of that kid. It was the parents' choice that ended the life of that kid. And that is wild to me because it's like, oh, my child is, the heart is on the outside of the body, but it's still within me. And, life's going to look so rough for that baby. But then we're going to override and not give them a chance to decide whether the quality of their life is good enough or not. And a lot of people with Down syndrome, who are pro-life will say, we are worth it. Obviously there are situations where, I'm not saying having Down syndrome is similar to having the heart on the outside of your body, but,
right. And
I have a hard time with people choosing whose lives are worth living,
Right. But Ellen, I think that feels a little unfair to say your life is not worth living. And also that we recognize that someone living in pain for 2 years and not being able to breathe or dying on a table, like these are actual decisions that people that have to make all the time.
Which would not be humane which is what that argument is to just say like, we want to put this baby out of their misery before it gets so bad that
or what they did is they took that baby home and they loved it. And then that baby died in its sleep 10 days after it got home.
And that's where I'm at too, is like, I believe that death should happen naturally, which is one of the tough things about the consistent life ethic, because I've also had to say, okay, if I'm going to do that, then I have to be against assisted death, which I want to be cool and liberal and be all for that because I think everybody has their choice, but do I have, so it's tricky.
Tricky. I think these are all like interrelated questions. Like, when do you take someone off life support? Like
are they a person anymore if they don't have brain activity?
They're not. They're legally dead, right? Like they're right. These are all the sort of like medical, but also meets these vast other criteria that are not that if we said this couple who decided against these surgeries that they were told were not going to result in like a good and healthy life, but would just be suffering for several years. And they looked at other families who did this. Like they followed this. It's not like they just, woke up and were like, oh, we know what we're going to do. Like they did all this research and then they said, you know what, and I just keep thinking like, what if we decided to legislate that you had to give your baby, this heart surgery, because what matters more than like your quality of life is survival. Right. Which is not what Christians believe. We are people who believe in the resurrection. Like this is not the end of the story for us. And so I think we have all of these stories like this out there of people who are with ethics boards and doctors in their church communities and their families. Like, I don't know a lot of people who gleefully decide like, I want to end my pregnancy. Like pregnancies end by abortion because something went wrong. It is always like this is not the thing that was supposed to happen.
Right. Although I do know, working in a clinic for many, many years, I did come across several people that used it as a form of birth control, which is just an education thing, I think.
Sure.
But there are a lot of people that don't. It isn't.
Yeah, but I do think it's fair to say every time something went wrong, right? Like,
right.
It's like
ideally there would have not been a pregnancy.
There would not have been a pregnancy. They don't want to be pregnant. It's this right. And so just making sure that we have this this ability to say, perhaps we need something outside of the state's system of punishment, and to be able to navigate these, because they require something beyond what is available for us legally, beyond legal categories.
Yeah. Do you make a connection? It seems like you do, but we've talked about people who are brain dead and you disconnect them from the machines. They're gone. There's no brain activity, to the prospect of at like in an early pregnancy, there's no brain activity. Kind of same playing field. Is that kind of the thought process that you're toying with?
Yeah, well, just that we make decisions. People make decisions all the time about these spaces where the space between life and death is gray.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. We do make these decisions all the time.
Yep.
And we make them with embryos. We make them with people on life support. We make them with decisions about whether we're going to pursue surgery or not, whether we're going to do put a do not resuscitate on our arm, right? Like that's
the death penalty everybody seems super comfortable with.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, all of these things, we live with this gray all the time. Now, it is only because this has become a politicized way to draw a base together around a deeply patriarchal, misogynistic form of legislation that this has become what it is in the United States.
Yeah. How about, and we can wrap this up. Well, what a note to wrap this up on, but partial birth abortion. Is that something that you see as kind of different territory? Because we are talking about typically, and I'm not super educated on it, but I think we're talking about a human with consciousness at that point.
Yeah. So I think people in the medical field would say partial birth abortion is not that's not a term. That's something the pro-life movement came up with to sort of make this like a hot button issue. Yeah. We're talking less than 1% of abortions happen in the third trimester, and they are always in the care of an ethics board at a hospital. And because that fetus cannot live outside the womb. Gotcha. The only place where there is any sort of differentiation for that is in Colorado, but in every state in the country, it is illegal. It is considered murder to end the life of a fetus in the third trimester.
Gotcha. So it does sound like some propaganda on the conservative side.
Absolutely propaganda. Gosh, the fact that this is like the number one issue when we have approximately 30 to 50% of all fertilized eggs die or are gone or are eliminated before a woman even knows that she has that's happened to her. Have you ever seen legislation to find out why half of humanity is disappearing from the earth? No, the focus is on partial birth abortion. 1% of abortion for babies who are going to die. Often these are like, I don't know if you've read any of these stories. These are the most heartbreaking stories I have ever read. Like when you get to that point, this is a child you wanted.
Yeah.
And
to me, it's almost the same as a child being on taking your child to Children's Hospital to be like
taken off life support. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So instead of, so again, the hypocrisy of this that Republicans don't seem to be worried at all about the 50% of fertilized eggs that never make it. I haven't seen any research about that.
Right.
Are you talking about IVF?
No, just generally, all like 50% of all fertilized eggs are never implanted.
Oh, you're talking about like miscarriage. Well, you can call it miscarriage, but like
it's not a miscarriage.
Naturally just.
Yeah, because it's not implanted. It's only a miscarriage if a fertilized egg is implanted. So before implantation, and Ellen, you said that you think that this is when it's life.
Well, this is why I'm anti certain forms of contraception, because if it makes like IUDs, for example, even the copper ones with no hormones, it makes the uterus an uninhabitable place. And so if you do get a fertilized egg, you're making it so it can't implant. And I think that that's pretty shitty. Just like if you had this is a bad example because I'm coming up with it on the fly, but if you had a person and you're saying like, nope, we're not going to feed you, we're not going to house you. Like, to me, it's kind of the same vibe. And that's another one where it's like, oh, damn it. Because I've landed on where I think life starts, I have to be like, I ethically opposed to those types of contraceptions that don't allow for implantation.
Yeah,
it's not a fun place to be, girl.
That's a really tough place to be.
Melissa, you're such a pleasant person, super intelligent. What would you have done if you got on this podcast and it was two dudes and we were just combative? Like, I'm
basically a dude that's combative, Joey.
Have you ever lost it a little bit? Have you ever been in a situation like that?
You are very patient,
Oh,
Melissa.
yeah. No, I have, I lose it on Twitter all the time, but it's kind of like mediated because it's like the written word. But yeah, I really think that, it's a position that I think that more Christians are just like, we're gonna figure out like just how serious this is, in a few years. Like, women are going to go to prison.
Ew, that's really. Oh, you're saying how bad the legislation.
Women are going to start going to prison for abortions. We're going to have a just maternal death rate.
You really think that is going to happen?
Oh, it's already starting. We have Mississippi legislators who are already drafting legislation for women to go to prison.
And you think that that'll pass? Of course,
and that
Mississippi, Ellen. Ellen lives in Seattle.
I know. Maybe it's because I live in Seattle.
These are hate laws against women.
I know. I know that that's actually real legislation. But because I live in Seattle and I'm like, no, that's a utopia. The world is not Handmaid's Tale.
Ellen, we had an Ohio legislator say that pass legislation all the way through their house requiring women to replant ectopic pregnancies into their wombs.
I can't.
Joey, that is medically impossible.
Yeah.
It's medically impossible.
Can we say the F word on this podcast?
Yes.
It's medically
I've already done it.
Impossible.
Yeah.
Like, that is how, like, we are talking about idiots who are making these laws. This is white identity politics at work in conservative states.
Yeah.
And it will continue. The people who will be on the losing end of this are going to be Black and brown women, usually who already have a child in the home. Most women who have abortions have a child already that they are supporting.
Yeah. And why do I feel like conservative white women who have abortions are not going to be as effective as the Black and brown women?
They'll just get effective birth control.
Yeah, and they'll be just given a slap on the wrist. Just like we see Black men going to prison for.
But it's a carceral system that is already being set up to Black women.
Oh, Mississippi.